today, after this program, we will have a program. It was originally supposed to be a children's program, but it turned into an adult program. So everyone's invited to come and see Josh Free talk about his book, Bicycle Bob. It will be at 4:30 until 5:30. Tomorrow we have You've Got to Read This. It will be held outdoors behind the library. It's called You've Got to Read This, and it's 5 librarians, and they will be talking about light summer reads. They will be suggesting light summer reads. And next Wednesday we have the outdoor concert at Chulo Park. It will be electro samba, and that's that. So next Wednesday will be at 7 p.m. Tomorrow will be at 2 p.m. and today will be at 4:30. So we hope to see you all there. And I will give the mic over to Mr. Dwoskin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Hi, everybody. And hi, everybody out in Zoom land. This is our last class for the before the summer break. So I had just a few kind of miscellaneous things to speak about and to go over, sort of to highlight before the summer, and plus one sort of subject that I wanted to speak in more detail about. That light is shining in my eyes. But I was just asked, I was just asked by someone to comment about Bill 96 and how this bill has certainly made, thank you very much. You know, the bill has made headlines, and to us in the Anglophone community, it's like one puzzle after another, or one restriction after another, starting with Bill 101 and actually starting with Bill 22 before Bill 101. If you remember, Bill 22 was the first language law passed in Quebec by the Liberal government of Mr. Bourassa at the time. And that had to do with eligibility to send your children to, and it required someone, a child, like 4 or 5 years old, to take a test, enough English to go into English school. And there was such a hullabaloo in the English community about that. And if you look back from now to then, you say, oh my God, wouldn't that have been, if that was the only bill, wouldn't that have been a wonderful, such a light restriction? Exactly, we'll take it. The stated object of Bill 101 was to defend and protect the French language. It was never stated in the bill how that would happen. Now, the rationale for doing it, it was stated. The rationale is French is threatened. French is a unique language in a sea of English in Canada and the US. That the French-speaking community in Quebec is surrounded on all sides by English-speaking people. And in order to prevent assimilation, and the example that they always used was Louisiana in the United States, how the French-speaking community of Louisiana was pretty well assimilated over 100 or so years, that in order to prevent that from happening, there has to be walls put up around French to protect French, like by a wall. And to do this, as we all remember, they passed all kinds of laws. The schooling law was pretty well the most important and drastic, I would say. And the whole movement to Bill 101 was really inspired by and pushed by the teachers' union. And what the teachers' union saw in the late 60s was that the percentage of immigrants going to English schools was equal to or greater than the percentage of immigrants going to French schools. And all they had to do was take a chart. You know, you remember the hockey stick chart of Al Gore that showed somehow that, you know, that if things keep going the way they are, the world would, you know, expire by the year 2050. So they used a similar idea, saying, well, if this continues for another 500 years, I'm joking, but that's the kind of the idea, that English speakers will outnumber French speakers in Quebec. So that was the main push and rationale for making this law force all immigrants to Quebec, including English-speaking immigrants, to compulsorily attend French schools. And by that stroke alone, it pretty well diminished the English community in the long run, since the English community has always, English-speaking community has always been bolstered by immigrants coming from abroad, whether English-speaking immigrants from British colonies in the US, or from just general immigrants who wanted to send their kids to English schools. I mean, in the day, we remember, and we're all old enough to remember, let's say up until the 60s, including the 60s, English was a very strong language of business in Quebec. It was maybe not the exclusive language of business, but it was pretty well understood that unless you spoke English in business, you wouldn't be able to, let's say, expand or to succeed, you know, unless you were dealing with a small town and a small population. So those were the sort of elements of the rationale behind the law. What it did not explain was, what it didn't explain was how diminishing the English-speaking community would help the French language. And that, in essence, was their argument, that the French language is in danger. Not that French Canadian people are in danger, because they weren't in danger, but the French language was. But in what way does diminishing English, the English community, help preserve the French language in Quebec? The rationale they gave was, well, there won't be anyone to assimilate to. But that is kind of, it was never really shown that this was a very big social event. No one ever did measurements, no one ever did studies, no one ever showed, well, how many people assimilate into the English milieu who are French Canadians to start with in Quebec. Outside of Quebec, no question that the French communities in Ontario and New Brunswick are slowly assimilating into the English-speaking milieu around them because of population distribution, because of business, as I was saying. It takes an effort to remain French-speaking in Ontario or New Brunswick, and even the more so in Manitoba. But in Quebec, it took no effort at all. Newspapers, radio, television, all the media, plays, you name it, everything was in French. It wasn't as if there was no French cultural food for the people to grow on. So therefore, this idea of assimilation was really a red herring. Really a red herring. In other words, it wasn't true. What was true was an attempt to shift power from the English speakers, especially in business, to the French speakers. It had nothing to do with defending language. In fact, if you want to look at assimilation, if we go outside of Greater Montreal, there were historically many English-speaking communities in Quebec. At the time of Confederation, meaning in 1867, Quebec was about 25% English-speaking and about 75% French-speaking. And more than half, or about half, of the English speakers, in other words, 1/8 of the total population of Quebec, were English speakers who didn't live in Greater Montreal. They lived everywhere else. This population has slowly assimilated themselves into the French milieu by intermarriage, mostly. Obviously some by moving out of those communities. But if anything, in other words, assimilation was going the other direction, not from French to English, but from English to French. So then Bill 101 was this draconian law, which was passed to solve a problem that didn't exist, but was just strictly a power grab, but with political overtones. What were the political overtones? Since the PQ government under Mr. Levesque intended to make Quebec an independent state, and since they knew that the minority communities would never go for it, the more minority communities that you could sort of induce to move out, the fewer voters that there were for this project. And that was a clear rationale, far more than the fear of assimilation rationale. And it worked, so that approximately 250,000 English-speaking Quebecers left Quebec since 1976, we'll call it. But not quite enough, because in the 1990 referendum, as you know, the fake referendum, I'll call it, the no side only won by 50.2%. So had they managed to get rid of more English-speaking people, the result would have been 50.2 the other direction. The timing wasn't quite right for that referendum. They should have waited. So after this bill was passed, there was some kind of a feeling in the English community that this might be temporary. In other words, once things settled down, once the English community recognized who's boss, that some of the provisions would be changed or moved back. In fact, none were changed and moved back. There were some that were changed and moved back, but this was the result of court cases taken up all the way up to the Supreme Court. And this especially had to do with the language of signs. So you might remember that the language of signs was one of the most irritating parts of Bill 101, which said that you couldn't, English in a certain sense is poison. And if you allow anyone to see it, they might get poisoned. And therefore it had to be removed on all outdoor signs. And they also said, well, outdoor signs, yes, but the metro counts as outdoors, because the people would see it, in other words. And that law was challenged up into the Supreme Court. Remember that Bill 101 was passed with the notwithstanding clause. Notwithstanding clause means we know we're doing something wrong. We know we're doing something illegal, but we're doing it anyway. And we have 5 years grace to do it. That notwithstanding clause has been renewed every single 5 years since 1976, which again, I'm sure was not the intention of the Constitution writers when they did this. I'm sure they had, they didn't have any idea that this would happen. I don't think anyway. So in other words, the government knew that this goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Quebec, which says that everybody should have equal rights, et cetera, et cetera. And there should be no discrimination on the basis of age, gender, language, or anything else. So that was Bill 101, and after the court challenge brought back English signs, but as you remember, the court said, the court decided that French may be predominant, but you couldn't erase English altogether. So if any of you ever walked into a Jean Coutu and you looked at those markers on the columns, and my eyesight is good, but not great, and you see, dental products, produits dentaires, and underneath it says dental products, but if you had a telescope and you really focused really hard, you might see the D in dental products. Otherwise, pretty well you're lost. You wouldn't know it was there unless you really looked hard for it. And the irony in some cases was that French-owned companies put more English signs than the English-owned companies, because the inspectors for Bill 101 were, of course, looking to crack down on English companies and not on French companies. So if you go to Quebec City, whose population is over 95% French speaking, there's tons of English signs, sometimes only English signs, and nobody complains, and there's nobody who makes secret calls to the Office Québécois de la Langue Française, to their snitch line, because everybody in Quebec City knows this is business. We're not accommodating the English-speaking community. We're accommodating tourists from all around the world. So that gets a pass. The other thing that got a pass was languages that were not written in Latin letters. So in other words, you would see signs in Chinese all over the place, on trucks, on restaurants, and everything else. Remember, at the time, there was no language other than French allowed on signs. But when the inspectors saw the signs on Chinese businesses, for them it was like decoration. For them it was like a drawing. It didn't say, best price on cars or best price on who knows what, right? They didn't see it as advertising. They didn't see it as a commercial sign. They saw it as some kind of just a sign to show it's a Chinese business. So it's quite odd that that's the way it went. So the fact that the English-speaking community dropped from 20% of Quebec's population to 10% of the Quebec's population should have sent a signal to the government that, quote unquote, Bill 101 was a success, and therefore French is no longer under threat. But it's such a popular law. It's so popular that, the signs touchez pas la loi 101, those signs don't touch Bill 101, like they show up everywhere when there's talk of even anything, One of the most egregious parts of this law was the idea that only communities that had over 50% English-speaking citizens would be allowed to serve their citizens in English. Now that seems so weird, right? Like, okay, so you have to serve everybody in French, that's the law. But you know that there's some towns out in the Pontiac that are more than 95% English. They have to send all their communications in French to their citizens, but they have to, register themselves to be able to serve their citizens in English. It seems so contradictory, whereas the city of Montreal, which does not have a majority English population, is not allowed to communicate with its citizens in English. So that was the intent of Bill 101. And the smart Alex of the Bill 101 people would say, you know what we have to do is check up every census to make sure that the population doesn't fall below 50% of Anglophones, because then we could take away their rights to serve their community in English. Now, how does this help French? How does it help French and protect the French language from having the city of Montreal send out a bilingual flyer? In other words, the rationale that they gave is completely wrong for what they ended up doing. But it was just a strict power play. So the case was brought to court in so many ways, in so many different, we'll call them, test cases. But in each and every time, they said, well, you're right. But the notwithstanding clause is there to say that notwithstanding all your rights, notwithstanding what justice is, the government said we're allowed to do it, notwithstanding the fact that we're wrong. In essence, that's what they're saying. And that notwithstanding clause is very powerful, and there's no extension for it. The rationale, I believe, that the people of the Constitution had was that they might pass something temporary for 5 years, but when they would have to face the electorate, they could never face up to the electorate by passing a law that was unfair to somebody. But they didn't understand the rationale of Quebec, or the philosophy of Quebec, which is that our version of democracy is a version where only the majority counts. The version of democracy, if you read it in political science books, is that the majority counts as only one element of democracy, but protection of minorities is another element. That protection is completely long and gone. What has happened since Bill 1 has been passed is that, in terms of minorities, Quebec has woken up to one minority, the Indigenous people. So it's kind of finally figured out, like the rest of the North America will say, or perhaps the world. The United Nations passed all kinds of declarations on the rights of Indigenous. Quebec has figured out that the Indigenous people do have some rights. And so they have been exempted from some of the Bill 101 laws. It was like that from the beginning, by the way, just to tell you. So if you wanted to see an English-only sign in Quebec, Ganawagi, that's where you had to go. And they didn't care. Ganawagi didn't care. They didn't care to put up French signs. You know how the Mohawks are extremely proud people. They say, we'll do what we want, how we want, when we want, and no one's going to tell us what to do. If we want to put up an English sign, we're doing it. And they did. In fact, their stop signs were bilingual, Mohawk and English. If you go there today, you'll see them there. So what's with Bill 96? Like, if all this was done, like, what more do you need? Remember that the CAQ party is a combination or amalgam of a few different streams in Quebec, one of which is the PQ stream. Another one is the rural, conservative, Catholic-oriented party, small c conservative, when I say that. So if you mix these two together, you get a pretty strong force of a party that represents everywhere in Quebec except the places where English is spoken, meaning not Greater Montreal and not the Pontiac. And therefore, all their voters couldn't care less about what English Quebecers have to say or what rights English Quebecers have or don't have. They're perfectly happy with saying, well, okay, we're defending French and that's it. A distinction was made in Bill 101 to say that since the English community historically had rights, and since the English community historically has lived in Quebec since 1760, but to be more accurate, really, it was in the early 1820s that English-speaking migrants started to come in from England. Community should have certain rights. They have a right to their own education and healthcare systems. But what we have to do is limit those rights as much as possible. And so they limited the rights by defining who's eligible to send their child to an English school. Now, here's another case where the courts made a decision. They originally said in Bill 101 that only an English parent who was educated in English in Quebec would have the right to send their kid to an English school. When that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, they said, no, that can't be, because theoretically, all Canadians should have the same rights. And therefore, they expanded that right to include all English-speaking people who went to school in English in Canada. So that's the way it is now, okay? But that right only applied, that definition only applied to schooling. In other words, if you were, let's say, a French Canadian and wanted to go to the Montreal General to get services there in English, you could, because it was an English-speaking hospital. The idea that this government has is to closely monitor the rights of English-speaking people who have, quote, English rights, and only allow those people to get rights to be served in English somehow by the government. You see, so that's quite a change. In other words, before, if you were, like if you called up Hydro-Quebec and it said you wanted to check on your bill, at the very beginning it said for French press 1, for English press 2. They got rid of that. That was a super complaint, you know. Then what they said was, okay, sometimes they said for French, stay on the line, an English message will follow, but it would follow 10 minutes later, you know, not like right away. And then when it said press English, you still got a French message, right? So, but theoretically, a French-speaking person who wanted to listen to English could press number 2 and wait his turn and get served in English. This is not what the government wants. They don't want French people to even hear English. So in other words, this is a kind of a continuation of the restricting the definition of who English people are and what rights they have. This was done by Bill 96. And so what they're saying is that only that group of people who even aren't all English speaking, who don't include all English speaking people. I mean, let's say, for example, right? You came from Jamaica or Hong Kong or the US or Great Britain. You came here 10 years ago. You had to send your kids to English, French schools. So those kids are now, let's say, 20 years old, speak English at home. Those kids don't have the right to press 2. They don't have the right to be served in English by Bill 96. Because they were not educated in English in Quebec, that special definition of who's the exception. And that's what this law tends to promote. That's what this law is trying to do. Now, up till now, what they're saying is, as you've heard, we rely on people's honesty, you know, to press which button they deserve to press, okay? At one point, they'll be giving out cards, like a you know, an SAQ card that says English on it with a code. And if you want to press 2, you'll say, please enter the code on your card. You know, that's the logic of where this is going to go. I mean, it's only logical, you know, step by step by step. And so we're not changing anything, right? Because you didn't have, you know, only English people have the right. It's just that we never enforced it. So now we're going to enforce it. So that's Bill 96. Now, you might ask yourself the following question, and I ask myself all the time. You know, with all the social studies being done in Quebec, no one has ever undertaken a study to measure what was the cost of Bill 101. How much business, GDP, population, etc., did Quebec lose by Bill 101? Such an important law, you'd think they'd have a follow-up. They have follow-ups for every darn thing, right? It's not politically allowed to make a study like that. And, you know, if an English person from McGill would do a study like that, they would just say, well, it's biased, the garbage in, garbage out. But that would be very important to do. Why I'm saying this is because to say, okay, besides the English-speaking people themselves, who are a small minority, French Canadian political people say, look, this is ridiculous. Not only is it ridiculous, where has been the French opposition to this law? The answer is pretty well nowhere. Pretty well nowhere. After all these years. Remember, we're talking now 20, 35 years, 30, 32 years, more or less. Now, there was a statement, if you carefully read the Suburban last week, Eric Duhem, the leader of the Quebec Conservative Party, he wrote that this is an absolute ridiculous idea about this pressing 1 and pressing 2. That the only eligible people should be allowed to press 1 or 2. He says, where does that get us? So you know, is kind of the first Quebec political voice from the Francophone milieu who's actually said that this idea of discrimination is wrong and impractical. But if you looked at the results of the last election, the provincial election, I'm going to go, you know what, I didn't intend to speak about this, but who asked me to? Somebody here asked me to. Yes, you did, thank you. The Liberal Party of Quebec pretty well, no, not pretty well, completely got 0 seats. In 0 seats, this is the main opposition party got 0 seats in Francophone Quebec. 0. And their leader was no great English rights leader, Madame Langlade, au contraire. So, you know, we understand what this is, okay? But here's the but. We all agreed to it. We all agreed to it in the following sense. We made a kind of a bargain with the devil. And the bargain that we made was, so long as Quebec stays in Canada, we agree to be second-class citizens. That was the question on the referendum that was asked, the constitutional referendum that failed. But Quebec, English Quebecers voted for it en masse. And, you know, so in a certain sense, that's basically what the situation is. Obviously, this has huge demographic implications for many of us. I don't think there's a single person in here who doesn't have relatives or children who left Quebec. I mean, it's especially among our community. But it is what it is. And, you know, it's not the first government that ever passed ethnically discriminatory laws, knowing that people will leave, and their idea was good riddance. Remember in the Sun Life building, when Sun Life moved their head offices, they wrote Bon débarras on the bottom there of the building, good riddance. So it was a decision. It wasn't like they said, oh, we know we're not going to suffer for it. They said, it's the suffering that we're going to have is worth it in the long run. Anyway, so that's that subject. Let's leave that one alone for now. Unless we got any, you know what, maybe comments, questions about this before I go to something else. So I wanted to speak, yes, okay, go ahead.
Has the Quebec government ever considered how much they've been spending over the years educating kids who will never stay here?
No, because it's not a relevant measure. It's really not a relevant. They don't care. They don't care. I mean, you know, how many, and also, by the way, there have been like, and this is not up to recently, not recently, but like before 5 years or 6, 8 years ago, many French-speaking people also left Quebec to go live, you know, elsewhere. So no one's going to say, oh, I want to refund university thing, you know. But we're now population-wise at a situation where more people are coming into Quebec than are leaving Quebec. That's a reversal of what was the case for so long. Yes, sir, over there.
In your opinion, in the long run, will all these flamings of the French Quebec government help, or will they, in the long run, wind up speaking English? Like we
I missed the very beginning of the question. I'm sorry.
I said, despite all the flamings of the
Well, right. So you're saying the question is, in the long run, will Quebec remain? Will Quebec remain French in the long run?
Right.
That's your question. My idea is yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the reason for it is that you know, we're not the only bilingual experimental country, province in the world. There's lots of them. In Switzerland, for example, the French-speaking people of Switzerland are 20% of the country. Not a single person would ever say, oh my God, French is going to disappear in Switzerland. No way. No, it's so not possible that German, which is the mother language of about 65% of Swiss people, there's more German people who speak French than French people who speak German. So in Switzerland. So in Belgium, where the populations are roughly 55-45, meaning 45 French, French isn't disappearing from Belgium. So it's very possible to have this kind of stasis, to have a situation where a majority is surrounded by minorities, a minority is surrounded by majorities, and they still retain their language.
Well, I put it to
You
you,
know.
that is not a valid comparison, because Belgium. is
They're
right next-
independent countries, and this is not. Is that it?
Belgium is right next to France, it speaks French, and in Switzerland, each language
Yeah.
section is unilingual, French,
Right.
Schweizerdeutsch.
Correct.
Italian.
Right.
Not the same situation.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very, very good point. Let me see if I can come up with a different example. There are examples going the other way, lots of them. In other words, where a minority language does lose its strength over time, like Welsh in Great Britain, for example. There's lots of examples like that. But there's other ones where no, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Where the minority language is official, or where it's a majority in a certain part, it stays that way. I'm just trying to think of some examples that you might know of. Well, I don't know. Let's say maybe Galicia in Spain, or Galician has an official status in Galicia, and it's still going pretty good. I was there not long ago, and people still speak it. Certainly Catalan in Spain, a minority language, no question. That's the Catalonians, in fact, they learned from Quebec. They sent emissaries to the office to take on some of their great wisdom. So Catalan is a minority language in Spain, as you know. It's spoken in the northeastern part of the country. In Barcelona, the capital of the Catalan state, it's also spoken in Valencia province. But I recall going there, and I've been to Barcelona lots of times, and I'm going there and I'm looking at signs, and I see a sign in Catalan, in English, and in French. And I say, wait a minute, something's missing here. What country are we in? And then I said, oh, this is the Bill 101 lesson. So that's that. They took that language aggressiveness to as far as they could possibly take it. And that is their way. So Catalan is not going to disappear, despite the fact that under the previous regime, they tried the hardest they could to make all those minority languages in Spain disappear. The Basque language, the Catalan language, the Galician language. Francisco Franco did not allow any printed matter, not a book, to be printed in Catalan. Never mind a newspaper, never mind a radio station, never mind nothing. So, I think that there's absolutely zero chance that French would disappear in Quebec, even in 100 years. That's my opinion, anyway. Yes, okay, there, yeah.
Why are the English people in Quebec known to be passive?
Sorry, I can't. Can you say it louder?
Why are the English people in Quebec, generally speaking, known to be passive about this situation?
Why are English-speaking passive? Why are English-speaking people passive? That's a good question. I'm going to answer it in two parts. I'm going to say part one, that this is a continuation of history of English-speaking Quebecers going back to at least 200 years, at least. English-speaking Quebecers have never had any kind of decent leadership of the community ever. And I'll give you the worst possible, the worst possible decision that they did, which was when Montreal was designated capital of Canada. Maybe this whole Bill 101 would never have happened had Montreal stayed capital of Canada. But the English-speaking people in Quebec, they didn't want this. They burnt down the Parliament building that was built here in Montreal. Because you know why? Because it offered French people some rights, and they didn't want that. They didn't want those rights to be defined. So they burnt down the capital. I think it was in the 1840s. And then they moved the capital to Kingston, Ontario. They said, okay, well, we'll move it to there. And then eventually went to Ottawa, for fear of the Americans invading. So, the English-speaking community has not had good leadership. So that's number one. Number two, the fact is, that banging your head against the wall is sometimes, not the most productive idea. And if you may remember that there was a huge petition that was signed by over 100,000 people, English-speaking people in Quebec against Bill 101. And, the government said, so what? Do you remember that petition? Some of you remember it? I'm sure some of you signed it. So in other words, you could say, and you could be right, that forget about petitions and speeches and stuff like that. Had the English-speaking community rioted against Bill 101, that might have had some results. I agree, that could have. But, burning down buildings, something, but a real riot, not just marching in the street, that doesn't count. But a real riot might have done something. But there was a real riot in when they burnt down the Parliament buildings in Montreal, which were down in Old Montreal area. A riot requiring soldiers, exactly, stuff like that. Then the government would say, well, you know what, maybe we went too far, we'll pull back a little bit. That would have been the result, since no government wants riots in their streets. But we never had the leadership to want to do that. We've never had the experience to say that this is going to work. So, so that's it. Now, had the stakes been different, in other words, if you didn't like it, right, you do what our kids did. You pick up and leave, or you leave yourself, or you just pretend it's not there and you just, do crossword puzzles. But had the stakes been different, in other words, had the cost been higher and being nowhere to go, perhaps the resistance might have been bigger. But, that wasn't the case. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good coverage of this subject. Let me just see here. What I wanted to speak about is a general subject about globalization, completely different perhaps, but to say that sometimes, when you're in the middle of something, you can't really see what's going on. And you can only appreciate things from a distance, looking backwards, to say, oh, this is really what happened, And we've had, since the end of the Second World War, a period of globalization. Globalization meaning communications, trade, movement of people from one place to another. And especially the sort of sharing out of the wealth of the world in a more distributed way. In 1950, the United States accounted for 1/2 of the total world economy. 1/2 of everything produced in the world in dollar value was produced in the US. Today, it's under 1/4. Since you know, since the end of the Second World War, you had international groupings made together. Of course, the United Nations is a good example. NATO, the European Union, all of these organizations and many, many more trading agreements said, look, we're better off to specialize in what we do well than into each country's being responsible to fulfill all of its needs. And it's logical to say that, but sometimes people don't get the idea of how important that is. So in other words, you know, if we wanted to in Canada, if this was our goal, we could grow every single banana we consume in Canada. We could do it right here. But what for? It would cost us $5 a pound for bananas to put them under greenhouses. And here we can get them from, you know, Costa Rica for 50 and 60 cents a pound. So better not waste the energy on growing bananas and do things that we can do better. That was a kind of an idea that didn't, you know, there were a lot of places that didn't believe that idea. There are a lot of places that said, no, we have to be self-sufficient. That's the only way we can be independent. That's the only way we could be strong. Especially in Latin America, they believed in that sort of self-sufficiency idea. But that all went away when free trade came about. The World Trade Organization. In 2010, China joined the World Trade Organization. China went from a country making $250 a year per person before 1978, when the economy opened up, to $11,000 per person today. That's an enormous jump. So in general, you could say that the third world, the developing world, did increase at a faster percentage than the developed world, but obviously starting from a much lower base. Let me just see here. Just one second. Yeah, so the end of the Soviet Union also opened up the world to more globalization, and computers and the internet meant that you could, you know, you don't have to be somewhere to do something. You could be anywhere to do something. Made communications easy. The invention of jet planes meant that you could move from place to place. You know, I was thinking when you people were young, we had planes, right? But to fly from, I don't know, here to Vancouver might have taken, I don't know, 8 hours or something with 3 stops. It was more convenient, but it wasn't convenient. And the amount of air travel in those days was tiny compared to the air travel today. The air travel today is like commuting. It's just like getting on a bus, especially, you know, in many places it's like that. So in other words, the world in a certain sense has become closer to each other, and the wealth has been more spread out and spread around, so that countries with low cost of labor take advantage of that. Countries with high technology take advantage of that. And banking and trading, banking and finance, because of the internet, has made everything more smooth. So what banking does, you know, banking is like oil, or it's like grease. It doesn't do the thing that's supposed to be done, but it smooths the way for the thing to be done. You know, otherwise you have to end up bartering. You know, I'll give you a sack of potatoes if you give me a sack of vegetables. You know, that was the old way of doing things. Now, banking says, okay, you know, just one click and it's in your account, or we'll loan you the money, and when, you know, you get paid, you pay us. So that's what's made the world much more efficient and much more close to each other. That was the trend going into, from the 1950s all the way up until recent times. In recent times, things have started to go backwards. The world is becoming deglobalized for many, many different reasons. Some of the reasons are the usual reasons, which is that If a country feels threatened, it says, I don't want to be dependent on another country to supply me what I need to live, to supply me with the batteries, to supply me with the microchips, to supply me with vital things that I need, or the food that I need. So when countries start to get hostile to each other, one of the first things that goes down is the trading between those countries, because there's no personal relationships to keep that trade going. Countries that trade with other countries that people don't like, they'll say, well, why are you doing this? Boycotts, right? Israel has been boycotted by the Arab states for so long because they say, well, we don't like you, so we don't want to help you. But we've seen lots of boycotts. Mr. Trump, when he got into office, he loves boycotts. Remember, he said, I love tariffs. I love tariffs. Why should a worker benefit from in China from what we buy here in the States? Why should we why should we export our jobs to them? And the exporting the jobs idea is partly true, because jobs that were done in the industrialized Midwest of the US, especially, were done cheaper elsewhere once globalization took place, once there was free trade. It's not as if low labor costs are the only answer. If low labor costs were the answer to making a country rich, Haiti would be, a millionaire, right? It's not just low labor costs. You need to have the infrastructure. You need to have the power system. You need to have the ports. You need to have airports. You need to have the banking system. You need to have a non-corrupt justice system. You need to have a somewhat educated population to be able to put 2 and 2 together and make 4. On top of having low wages, you need all those things together. So Africa doesn't have all those things. So despite that being the poorest continent, they haven't jumped up like Asia. And Asia did the most jumping. I mean, East Asia, I gave you the example of China. India today is jumping the way China was jumping before. So there is this kind of spreading out, and the internet and new science and maybe artificial intelligence, it makes things so much easier to do the work abroad. And you can do, you see the signs on Lululemon. Who likes Lululemon here? Anybody know what that is? Designed in Vancouver, made in China. That's what it says. So sure, designed in Vancouver, you put it on the computer, you press a button, a guy in a Chinese factory gets the design, boom, 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 and ships the stuff out and on the port, and it comes back to North America on the next shipment. That's how globalization works. The advantages of it, of course, are that it makes things cheaper. It makes people who specialize in what they're doing and know what they're doing, they're able to create a product at the lowest possible price. And who benefits from that? Everybody who buys it. So that explains in part the continuous rise in standard of living that the whole world has had over quite a while now, with a few little dips. The other thing that put a crash in globalization was, of course, the COVID pandemic, right? Obviously, everything shut down, they shut down. The ports shut down, factories shut down. I need to get my stuff, I can't get it. How am I gonna get it? You know what, maybe what I should do is build a factory somewhere closer to where I am, so at least if I had to, I could send a truck there and pick it up. So the COVID epidemic, which lasted 2 full years, put globalization into reverse gear. The term nearshoring, you might have heard that term. Nearshoring means like, I won't make stuff in the US. I can't possibly pay $20 an hour to a worker making a bunch of plastic chairs. But what I could do is, instead of making it in China, I could make them in Mexico. I can make them in Central America. And Mexico has benefited the most from this whole nearshoring idea. of the 70 major countries, major economies in the world in the last year, from June 22 to June 23, whose currency has gone up the most against the US dollar? Mexico. Mexico. Used to be 20 pesos to the dollar, they're now at 17 pesos to the dollar. Because of all the money coming into Mexico from, among other things, manufacturers relocating from the Far East to come to Mexico. And then, of course, there's the external hostility between China and the U.S., where the U.S. is, Trump said, I don't want to depend on China for anything. And so companies who were making things in China said, okay, we'll make them in Vietnam, we'll make them in Cambodia, we'll make them in the Philippines, we'll make them in Indonesia. And those are countries that benefited from this exit from China. Now, it wasn't just because of that reason, it was because wages in China went up so much that for low-end garment manufacturing, it doesn't pay to make them in China anymore, but to make them in those cheaper countries. But that's kind of how, the flow of trade back and forth has changed. So we are becoming more centered on our own selves now than before. Some things it's possible to do, obviously, some things it's not. The war in the Ukraine and Russia, I mean, another example, how that stopped world trade completely. It stopped Russia from exporting its oil and gas and minerals to where they could get the highest price. It stopped the Ukraine and Russia from exporting grain to countries that need it. And, it caused a whole revolution in the pattern of fossil fuel exports to the rest of the world. So in other words, this wave that we had of globalization has sort of lifted, a rising tide raises all boats. You ever heard of that expression? So that rising tide sort of hit a top, let's say pre-COVID and pre-Trump, and then it's just started to go back down again like that. And of course, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. So one thing we do know is that this going down is going to cause higher prices. And guess what? Bingo, we have higher prices. The higher prices come because it's cheap to make stuff in China, but if you want to make it somewhere else, it's going to cost you more. That whole idea of saying, well, I want to pick this, or you say, okay, I will pay a company to establish a factory in the US. Okay, that money doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes out of somewhere. So yes, you might get a few hundred workers employed to make, for example, glass windshields, like I saw a film about that. But you could have got those glass windshields from China for cheaper than they're making them in the US. So somebody is paying. They're paying for the factory and they're paying, for the extra high price that those windshields are costing. In Canada now, we have this whole idea about building battery factories in Ontario. You've heard of that business. I don't know what the Canadian government said they were going to build, but when they stopped paying, they stopped making the factory. It was in the billions that they were subsidizing. Which one was it? I don't remember. Ford. Is it Ford? Yeah. To build a battery factory in Ontario somewhere. So, Volkswagen. Yeah, Volkswagen. That makes more sense. Yeah, and cars too. Like this new NAFTA that President Trump insisted on, said that there's free trade among Canada, US, and Mexico. However, for free trade in cars, right? For a car to be considered to be US, Mexican, or Canadian, that car has to have at least 65% of its components made in the three countries, and the workers have to be paid a certain amount. So obviously, this is going to raise the price of the cars, obviously, because if before there wasn't a restriction, then, in the old days, Japan, they would take a car, disassembled, put it in a box, bring it to the US, open up the box, put the car together and write made in the USA on the car. The only thing made in the USA on the car was a sign that said made in the USA, the sticker. But, nowadays, obviously, you can't get away with that and sell that car under the NAFTA free trade agreement, rules and regulations type of thing. Let me just see what other points I had here. Oh yes, here's one of current interest. That we're talking about deglobalization. Brexit, the exit of Great Britain from the European Union, is another example of that same kind of nationalism which causes economic pain. And finally, we're 10 years down the road just about, some British politicians have said, well, maybe we made a mistake, that Britain was better off in the European Union than what they are now. My prediction, you asked me for a prediction before about something else, right? About French Quebec. I believe Britain will go back into Europe at some point. I think that it's so logical, it's so logical that if the Labour Party gets elected, which they will, there will be voices saying, you know what, we should somehow get back into the European Union. Maybe step by step, not, jumping in like in a swimming pool.
Just one question.
Yeah.
Wasn't the main reason that Brexit was approved, that people didn't want mass immigration going through Europe into Britain?
That's correct. That was the reason. It had nothing to do with economics. It had to do with prejudice and fear that if people could go wherever they wanted, that Britain will be overwhelmed by immigrants coming from Europe or through Europe to get to Great Britain. And, the feeling against immigrants is similar to that in other places. In other words, a kind of a fear of your group being overwhelmed by foreigners, number one, a fear of competition for jobs, a fear of having to pay, the government having to pay services like education and health care and welfare to people who just arrived. And all those things together, along with a nice dose of plain old nationalism, or I won't say racism, but just the feeling of not liking other people, was the main push for Brexit. And the fact is that Great Britain this past year had more immigration than any time else in its history. 602,000. I was reading about this today. 602,000 net migrants. Net meaning, entrances versus exits and what's left over. 602,000 people came to Great Britain, which is, pretty close to 1% of the population. It's pretty darn close to that number. And it's a pretty high number, but the irony is that the economists and business people want immigration because they need the jobs more than ever. As we're getting to be older and older and older, there's fewer and fewer of us to take the jobs. And going back to Quebec, the Quebec Business Council told Mr. Legault, listen, we need more immigrants in this province. And Mr. Legault said, well, we have to defend French. And they said to him, listen, we need people to pick strawberries. We don't care about French. What do the strawberries care about French? Otherwise you're going to have a train. You're going to force us to pay people from Guatemala to fly in here, to live in crappy housing and to send them back. Like, how does that pay? And, of course, Mr. Legault doesn't much care. So that's our situation. We're short of labor, not just here, but in pretty well every Western country where the number of youth is just not there compared to the number of older people to pay our pensions. The other choice is to cut the pensions and say, okay, that's it. We don't have enough workers to pay into the pension plan. We have to cut pensions. Or you get more workers. That's the only two choices you have. Anyway, I just want to just check my notes again. Sorry, see, there's something else that I had to mention. Of course, I had like 4 pages of notes and I only talked about one. Yeah. Yeah, of course, that the countries who suffer the most are the ones that have civil wars. So I said, that, when you rise, the ones on the bottom will rise quicker. But if you're Somalia or Yemen or Sudan or Afghanistan, you can have the lowest wages in the entire world, but nothing's going to help if there's no security for business people to operate. So that goes without saying. Yeah, I was going to talk about Juneteenth, but we didn't get to that. Let me just summarize by just looking forward a little bit, to mention the biggest thing going on in the world today, of course, is the Ukraine-Russia war. And, hopefully I'll see you all again in the fall, and for sure by the fall, nothing will be changed. It's just a horrible situation where billions of dollars and lives are being poured into this conflict for no good reason. And this money is coming from everyone. It's coming from us too, it's just a sad situation to see 4 presidents of Africa going to Russia and the Ukraine to beg them to stop fighting because, they need the grain that comes out of both countries. And it's really one of the tragedies, and one where if we were back in the Cold War period, if we were back in the Soviet period, and the Soviets invaded a neighboring country, the NATO would have responded. But because Ukraine is ex-Soviet Union and not in NATO, people are willing to give money, to give weapons, but not to get, involved with their own military, which is, I think that's a correct decision, by the way, but it just means that Russia can wear the Ukraine down over time. And also, it's a lot easier to be on the defense than on offense. Because right now, Ukraine is on the offense. That's hard. It's easier to be on defense where you dig yourself in, and you have all the technology of spy satellites and drones and everything to fight. It's a very high-tech war. It seems like it's not, but it's not on the one hand, and it is on the other hand, because the high-tech is what gives all the information to where to go and where the people are. Anyway, I've got so many other things I want to speak about, but it's time. So let me see if you've got some questions or comments, and then maybe I'll just throw in 2 little things, and that'll be that. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
You say with the economic advantage making it in China, we can get an awful lot of stuff cheap, and that's very good for us.
Right.
But if China gets mad at us and decides we don't need Canada, we cut them off, all the shelves in this person will be empty. So how do you deal with that situation?
Well, China has definitely tried this. Okay. We're against us a little bit, but against Australia big time. Because Australia, the former right-wing Prime Minister of Australia said some nice things about Taiwan, and it really pissed China off. And they said, okay, well, we're not buying, your wine, we're not buying your lobsters, we're closing off or slowing down our coal imports. And Australia felt it right away. They really did. Plus, now I just read, and maybe you saw this just this week on one of the American news stations. They were in Taiwan, because there's a lot of trade between Taiwan and China. As much as you think they don't like each other, I mean, you know, Foxconn, which is the largest assembler of anything, including Apple phones in the whole wide world, they have hundreds of thousands of employees in China, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. All the Apple products are made in China by Foxconn. China in one day decided to stop importing Taiwanese pineapples. So they went to, it was, what's her name from PBS? It was PBS, I saw it on PBS. She went to a Taiwanese pineapple farm, and the guy said, like, we had boxes of stuff ready to go. What are we supposed to do with all this stuff? They stopped importing Chinese, Taiwanese grouper, which is a fish, and pineapples. So they showed this warehouse of groupers, of boxes of fish, like frozen from the ceiling to the floor of boxes. They said, we don't know what to do with all this stuff. So yes, in other words, a big customer can have a large effect on a small producer. But if China and the US get into a trade war, everybody loses, because, you know, US buys so much from China, and China also buys a lot from the US and from, you know, Western companies. A lot of the Western companies made their biggest profits in China over the past 10 years, because that market was growing faster than anywhere else. GM, General Motors, sells more cars in China than they sell in the United States, just to give you an idea. So, I mean, that's the way it goes. Let me just change this, if you allow me, just two small things, okay? I was going to mention this Juneteenth holiday, you know, which was yesterday, June 19th, the anniversary of the freeing of the slaves in Texas. That's where it comes from. But I wanted to mention two really big, the biggest anti-Black riots that occurred in the US, which you may have heard of and you may not have heard of, but they were unique in a certain sense. One was in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was once the biggest city in North Carolina, right on the coast. And after the Civil War, for a while, not for very long, the Republican Party, like people who took part in the Civil War were ineligible to vote. And all the Blacks were eligible to vote. So what happened was, for the first 5 to 10 years, you had Republican state houses, Republican majorities, and even Black governors in some of the southern states. Now, quickly that was reversed when the whites decided to take power into their own hands. But in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a kind of a coalition between Blacks and white workers who maintained the office of mayor in Wilmington. And Wilmington developed a kind of a Black middle class and a Black-owned newspaper. The only one, the newspaper for Wilmington was Black-owned. And it came to the usual thing that happens, some you know, incident between a Black and a white. Usually it's between a Black guy and a white woman. That the defending of women's honor seems to be like the #1 thing in the white supremacist playbook. And a riot came down onto Wilmington, and they burned down, of course, the newspaper. They forced the mayor and all his council to resign by force, by gun force. 60 to 200 people were killed in that riot. And it was the only sort of example of a coup that took place in the United States, where an armed gang came in by force, threw out the elected officials, took power, and never gave it up. So that's what happened in Wilmington. Much better known is the riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where you had a Black middle class district, which was well established, with a completely self-sufficient Black middle class district. And again, what happened was, you know, supposedly some white guy insulted a Black guy insulted a white woman, and the whites came down with their guns and burned down the entire 35 square block area. If 35 square blocks is 35 blocks long and 35 blocks wide and 35, it's like, you could say it's something like all of Cote-Saint-Luc, like up here, that's about the size of it. They burnt it all down. They killed, again, anywhere from 75 to 300 people, and then covered it all up. The Black people who were living there took off for the most part. So there was nobody there to sort of remember. Nothing was ever written up it was written up in the papers, Blacks caused riot in Tulsa. But besides that, it was all forgotten until recent times when things, they started again building and looking, and they find stuff under the ground and say, hey, what's this? And then from this, it goes from, from one thing to another. And people who were alive at the time, who never wanted to speak about it, finally, they spoke about it, or they spoke about what their parents told them about it. And now this has gotten, major commemoration in Tulsa, which happened 100 years ago. And how did the Blacks get to Tulsa in the first place? Want to hear something super interesting? That in the 1830s, there was this Indian removal of the indigenous people, sorry, I can't say that word Indian, but indigenous people from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, were all forcibly moved by President Jackson from those places to what was called Indian Territory, which is the whole eastern half of Oklahoma. Those Indians had Black slaves. Those Black slaves moved with them to the Indian Territory, where they were supposedly given rights and stuff. I mean, the Indians given rights. And that's how the first Blacks got there. Added on to Blacks who moved there earlier from the South, just to get out of, Dodge, so to speak. So that's how the community got itself established there in Oklahoma. Anyways, so listen, I want to thank you all again. I want to just tell you what a pleasure it is for me to stand here and speak to you in person instead of looking on some stupid screen. I have to repeat that again. It's so hard to do, it really is. And I hope to see you all in the fall. So thanks again.